Captain Elias Rain stood on the command deck of the Eidolon, Earth's spearhead in deep space warfare. Through the reinforced viewport, an eerie expanse of silent wreckage drifted, fragmented ships casting long shadows against the backdrop of a gas giant's glowing rings. His hands rested on the edge of the console, knuckles pale under the strain of his grip. Each passing second felt heavier than the last. "Status?" he asked, his tone clipped yet steady. "Debris field extends for 8 kilometers," Lieutenant Callan reported, scanning the shimmering holographic display. His voice carried a measured calm that didn't quite mask the tension brewing beneath. "We've identified remnants from both our allies and unknown vessels. No life signs so far." Rain's sharp blue eyes flicked toward the display, which rotated and highlighted a jagged fragment of what used to be a cruiser. Its hull was scorched black, the plating crumpled inward like paper under immense force. Something about the scene gnawed at him. This wasn't just a battlefield. It was a slaughter. The oppressive stillness inside the bridge was punctuated by a soft, rhythmic vibration underfoot, the subtle thrum of power conduits running through the ship's core. The faint tang of recycled air clung to the back of his throat, sharp and metallic. Everything about this moment felt wrong. "Elias," First Officer Harlan murmured, stepping closer. His weathered face bore years of experience etched into lines of quiet authority. "We shouldn't be here blind. Whatever did this might still be lurking." Rand's gaze didn't waver. "And if they are, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with." The crew's murmured acknowledgments filled the brief silence, a collective bracing for what lay ahead. The Eidolon was no stranger to hostile territory, but this was different. "Deploy reconnaissance drones," Rain ordered, his voice steady as steel. "Full spectrum analysis. I want every signal, every anomaly within 20 clicks." "Yes, sir," Callan replied, his fingers dancing over the controls. Moments later, small silvery drones launched from the Eidolon's underbelly, vanishing into the void like ripples in a dark sea. A soft chime signaled an incoming report. "Captain," said Ensign Malik from the comm station, "we're picking up residual radiation signatures, levels consistent with high-intensity gravimetric weaponry." Rain's jaw tightened. Gravimetric weapons weren't standard issue for any known adversary. This meant something far worse than rogue pirates or a local skirmish. "Triangulate the origin," Wren said, his tone sharp. Malik hesitated. "The readings? They're fragmented, sir. Multiple spikes, but they're concentrated." "Captain," Callan interrupted, his voice taut with alarm. "New contact, dead ahead." Wren turned to the viewport. Emerging from the shadows of the debris field was a massive shape, angular and menacing. Its hull bore jagged, asymmetrical ridges that seemed almost organic, and its surface shimmered faintly, like a heat mirage in space. A low murmur rippled through the bridge. "Battle stations," Wren commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Bring us into formation and prepare for engagement." The crew snapped into motion. Lights dimmed to combat mode, and the faint hum of readiness surged through the air. As the Eidolon moved into position, Wren felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This wasn't a routine patrol. It was the beginning of something far worse. Captain Elias Wren's fingers hovered over the control interface as the massive alien vessel loomed larger in the viewport. The glow of its hull, faintly iridescent, refracted light like oil on water, creating a strange, hypnotic ripple. His gut tightened. Something about the ship felt alive, its jagged form too precise and chaotic at once. "Distance?" he asked, his tone edged with urgency. 6,000 meters and closing," Callan replied, his voice thin against the tense air. "No active weapons detected, but their energy readings are unstable." Elias leaned forward, gripping the edge of his console. The faint vibration beneath his boots shifted, a subtle reminder of the Eidolon's careful maneuvers. Around him the bridge buzzed with muted activity. Hands flew over controls, voices exchanged data in low, clipped tones, and the faint tang of sterilized air mingled with the metallic bite of heated circuits. "Magnify the visual," Elias commanded. The viewport image expanded, filling the screen with the alien vessel's grotesque details. Its surface was scarred, pockmarked by impacts that left molten gouges cooling into brittle, darkened veins. The silence of space made its battered state feel even more haunting. "Captain," Malik said from the comm station, his voice breaking the moment, "we're getting fragmented data from the drones. Some sort of interference, possibly deliberate." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the ghostly ship ahead. "What about the gravimetric readings?" "Off the charts," Callan muttered, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. "If this thing deployed the weapon, the damage to that debris field, it makes sense." "Or," Harlan interjected from Elias's left, his gravelly tone deliberate, "they're using the interference to mask something worse." Elias frowned, his pulse thrumming as he processed the layers of risk. The Vorak were masters of deception, but this ship's vulnerability didn't align with their typical overconfidence. "Bring us to a halt," Elias ordered. "Keep weapons hot, but don't fire unless provoked." The Eidolon slowed, its powerful engines humming in response, though the noise remained insulated behind the thick hull. A faint shudder ran through the deck as thrusters compensated for the inertial shift. "Scanning for life signs," Malik called out, his fingers darting across the console. Seconds ticked by, punctuated by the steady chirp of monitors and the faint click of boots pacing across the deck. The air felt colder, heavier. Every sound seemed sharper, the weight of anticipation stretching the moment taut. "Confirmed," Malik finally said. 17 signatures, weak, scattered across their ship. A silence fell, thick and uneasy. Elias's hand tightened on the console as he considered their next move. "Could be bait," Harlan said, low and cautious. "Or survivors," Elias countered, his voice steady. He knew the risk, but couldn't ignore the possibility of life, potential allies, intelligence, or even an edge against the Vorak. "Malik, open a tight beam channel to the alien vessel," he ordered. "Let's see if they answer." The channel hissed to life, a sharp static that made Elias's teeth grit. Then, faintly, a sound broke through, ragged and disjointed, like a voice dragged through gravel. "Help us." Elias's jaw set. The words were crude, guttural, and laced with desperation. He turned to his crew, meeting their eyes. "Prepare a boarding party," he said firmly. "If there's something to salvage, we'll find it. But no mistakes. This could still be a trap." As the bridge erupted into motion, Elias's gaze lingered on the alien vessel, a monolith of secrets waiting to be unraveled. The Eidolon edged closer, its light slicing through the void. He could feel it in his bones. Answers waited within, but so did danger. The airlock hissed open, releasing a sharp gust of sterilized pressure as Captain Elias Wren stepped into the boarding chamber. The faint hiss was followed by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch far longer than the brief pause. His gloved hand adjusted the seal on his suit, the faintly luminous heads-up display casting faint glints on his visor. Behind him, the boarding team of 6 assembled with quiet efficiency, their breathing audible in the confined space. "Stay close," Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the stillness. "No unnecessary risks. Whatever's inside, we're taking no chances." The alien vessel loomed ahead, its jagged airlock gleaming with an otherworldly sheen. It reminded Elias of fractured glass frozen in the moment of shattering, a beautiful yet violent image. The docking tunnel rattled faintly as the team stepped forward, magnetic boots clinking in a grim, unhurried rhythm. The metal underfoot was unnervingly cold, the chill seeping through layers of reinforced fabric like a whispered warning. As the hatch to the alien ship opened, a low creak echoed, unnatural and drawn out, sending a ripple of unease through the team. Beyond the entrance, dim light flickered sporadically, illuminating jagged, irregular corridors that appeared more grown than constructed. The walls glimmered faintly, like veins of obsidian pulsing with a life of their own. Elias swept his rifle ahead, his trigger finger resting lightly but purposefully. "Movement?" he asked sharply. "Negative," muttered Private Keller, the youngest member of the team. His voice trembled, though he quickly masked it with a cough. "Still scanning." The air inside the alien ship carried a density that felt oppressive, almost tactile, as though every breath carried the weight of its history. There was no obvious stench, only a faint metallic tang and something subtler like a charged storm waiting to erupt. It scratched at the edges of perception, raising goosebumps beneath the protective layers. Elias advanced cautiously, his boots making muted thuds against the uneven flooring. As they passed a shattered console, thin wisps of vapor rose from scorched grooves along the surface. It was as if the vessel itself bore scars of agony, the metallic remains twisted into grotesque expressions of suffering. "Captain," whispered Harlan, his voice low but insistent. "This ship, it's been through hell." Elias didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on a doorway at the end of the corridor, half-sealed and glowing faintly along its jagged edges. A faint sound emerged, scraping, erratic and unsteady, like a predator dragging itself through the dark. "Lieutenant," Elias called softly, gesturing toward the door. "Prepare breach protocols." Valar, the squad's tactical expert, stepped forward and knelt with practiced precision, affixing charges to the warped frame. His face was set in grim concentration, his hands working with deliberate care. "Ready," Valar said, nodding toward Elias. "Execute!" The charge detonated with a blinding flash, and the door gave way, collapsing inward with a heavy groan. The team moved swiftly, rifles raised, sweeping their beams across the room beyond. They froze. 5 alien forms lay crumpled on the floor, their bodies limp yet unnervingly intact. Their translucent skin shimmered faintly, revealing fragmented patterns of internal structures that pulsed weakly, like the fading rhythm of a dying heart. One of the figures shifted, its head tilting toward them, and Elias caught the faint glimmer of its eyes. They were dark and endless, reflecting his team back at them, fractured and distorted. "Help!" the alien rasped, its voice carrying a raw, multi-tonal edge. Elias felt a chill run through him. Whatever was ahead, the answers wouldn't come easily. The alien's voice lingered in Elias's mind, a strange harmony of desperation and raw survival. The faint, multi-tonal rasp echoed in the room's dense air, saturating the silence with an unnatural weight. His team hesitated, their rifles steady but their resolve wavering. "Captain," Harlan murmured, his voice a whisper thick with unease. "What's the call?" Elias stepped forward, narrowing his eyes at the alien form sprawled across the uneven floor. The translucent figure closest to him shifted again, its movement sluggish and pained. Beneath its glistening surface, faint pulses of light flickered in its chest, like failing embers clinging to life. "They're alive," Elias said, his voice firm but low. "Valar, scan for threats. Harlan, secure the perimeter. No assumptions." Valar knelt beside the nearest alien, his handheld scanner emitting a soft, rhythmic pulse. The device's translucent display glowed faintly as alien anatomy materialized in fractal-like layers, organs that shifted, dimmed, and brightened in rhythmic patterns Elias couldn't comprehend. "They're stable," Valar muttered, "but barely. Some kind of stasis override is keeping them alive. If we move them, we risk disrupting—" A sudden vibration rippled through the floor, cutting him off. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried an unsettling depth, like a distant landslide rolling through hollow canyons. "Perimeter breach!" Harlan barked, his rifle snapping to the doorway. Elias turned sharply, his grip tightening on his weapon. A low groan echoed from the corridor they'd entered, followed by the unmistakable screech of metal grinding against itself. Shadows stretched and twisted as faint flashes of light danced across the jagged walls. "Positions!" Elias ordered, his tone ice-cold. The team shifted fluidly, their movements precise but tense. Elias stepped back, his gaze darting between the doorway and the aliens on the floor. Their faint, flickering pulses seemed to mirror his own rising heartbeat. The grinding grew louder, sharper, each metallic shriek slicing through the silence. Then it stopped. The sudden stillness felt suffocating, pressing down like a held breath. A shape moved in the shadows beyond the doorway, lithe and angular, its outline barely discernible. Elias caught a glint of something metallic, its surface reflecting the faint ambient light like liquid silver. "Contact," Harlan said tersely, his finger hovering over the trigger. Elias raised a hand, signaling restraint. "Wait." The figure stepped forward, its movement eerily smooth, like liquid flowing uphill. As it emerged fully into the dim light, Elias's chest tightened. It wasn't Vorak, but it wasn't something he recognized either. The creature's elongated form shimmered with shifting patterns, its surface alive with microscopic fractals. Its eyes, deep-set and impossibly bright, locked onto Elias. The creature emitted a sound, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through Elias's core. It wasn't communication. It was a warning. "Harland," Elias whispered, "fall back position. Valar, mark the exit point." Before they could move, the alien figure shifted, raising an appendage that glowed faintly with swirling patterns. The glow intensified, spreading across its body in waves, as though it were drawing energy from the ship itself. "Captain," Valar's voice was tight, the scanner in his hand flickering wildly, "this thing's feeding. If we don't act, move," Elias barked, firing a controlled burst at the creature. The shot struck its shimmering form, disrupting the glow but failing to penetrate. It recoiled, emitting a piercing, resonant wail that sent shockwaves through the air. The team scrambled, retreating toward the breach point as the walls themselves seemed to react. The jagged surfaces pulsated faintly, light coursing through them like veins coming alive. Behind them, the alien figure advanced, its glow growing brighter, its wail escalating into an almost deafening crescendo. Elias glanced back once as the team crossed into the docking corridor. The figure stood at the threshold, its light dimming slightly, as though it couldn't leave the room. Its eyes burned into his, an unspoken message searing itself into his mind. "Seal it," he snapped. The airlock groaned shut behind them, the metallic clang reverberating through the chamber. Elias turned to his team, sweat streaking his forehead as his breathing slowed. "That wasn't Vorak," he said finally, his voice steady but grim. "And it wasn't friendly." Valar stared at him, pale and shaken. "Then what the hell was it?" Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. The docking chamber fell into uneasy silence, the metallic clang of the sealed airlock reverberating like the closing of a coffin. Captain Elias Wren's breaths came slow and measured, his fingers loosening their tight grip on his weapon. The alien figure was no longer in sight, but its presence lingered, a shadow on his thoughts that refused to dissipate. "Valar, give me a damage report," Elias commanded, his voice steady but edged with tension. Valar, his scanner still flickering erratically, gave a grim shake of his head. "No structural breaches in the corridor, but that thing... It wasn't just alive, Captain. It was interacting with the ship, like it was drawing from it, feeding, adapting." "That's impossible," Harlan muttered, his usual calm cracking under the strain. "This isn't some kind of hive organism. Ships don't bleed energy." "And yet it did," Elias said sharply, cutting off the argument. He needed answers, not speculation. His eyes swept the team. "Check your suits, monitor oxygen levels and electromagnetic interference. Whatever's happening on that ship is hostile, and I won't have us compromised by something we don't understand." The corridor's muted lighting seemed to dim further as the team worked. Shadows gathered in the crevices of the docking tunnel, their movements unnatural under the flickering bulbs. Elias focused on the sensation of the suit's filtered air, colder than usual, and the faint prickle of static across his exposed fingertips when he adjusted his wrist controls. The ship's atmosphere, once sterile and predictable, now felt volatile, as though it carried an unseen weight. "Captain, we've got a situation," Malik's voice crackled over comms. "Sensors just picked up movement, originating from the alien vessel. It's spreading." "Define spreading," Elias said, tension hardening his tone. "Unidentified energy signatures are seeping into our docking clamps. They're shifting frequency patterns as they go. It's not static, it's deliberate." Elias's stomach twisted. "Shut it down. Whatever systems are connected, isolate and purge." "Already tried, sir. The signals are overriding our fail-safes." Elias turned to Harland. "Cut physical links to the docking clamps. If it spreads to navigation or life support, we're dead in space." Harlan gave a tight nod, motioning for 2 crewmen to follow him. The sound of their boots echoed faintly as they disappeared into the adjoining service hatch. Elias clenched his jaw, his mind racing through contingencies. Every moment they remained tethered to the alien ship increased the risk of contamination, and with no clear understanding of the enemy's capabilities, every decision felt like playing with fire. A sharp crack jolted him from his thoughts. The air around them rippled, a wave of pressure shifting through the corridor. It wasn't sound, it was something deeper, a sensation that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the chest. "Velar, report!" Elias barked. Velar's scanner display went black, the faint glow extinguished as he cursed under his breath. Electromagnetic interference just spiked. "Whatever's on that ship, it's accelerating." Before Elias could respond, the corridor's walls pulsed with faint light, a rhythmic glow spreading outward like veins of molten silver. The pattern moved with a purpose, creeping closer to the sealed airlock. "What the hell is it doing?" Harlan's voice came over comms, strained and hurried. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't tear his gaze from the airlock. The light's pace was methodical, relentless, and something in its rhythm felt communicative. "Captain," Malik called, his voice cutting through the growing tension, "we just intercepted a signal. It's coming from that thing on the alien ship." Elias froze, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "What kind of signal?" "It's coordinates," Malik said, hesitating. "Deep space, uncharted. And, Captain, they're not human." The pieces swirled in Elias's mind, chaotic and unresolved. Whatever the entity was, it wasn't just a threat, it was sending a message. To whom and for what purpose, he didn't know. But the thought chilled him to his core. "Pull us back," Elias said, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "Disengage from the ship and isolate our systems. We're not leaving until we figure out where those coordinates lead. But we won't wait to find out what happens if we don't move now." The team moved swiftly, but the glow on the airlock continued, a silent promise that whatever mystery lay ahead, it was far from finished. The Eidolon shuddered as it began the disengagement process. The docking clamps groaned as Harlan and his team severed the physical links to the alien vessel, sparks arcing in sharp bursts as the manual overrides took effect. Elias Wren watched the viewport, his gaze fixed on the alien ship, as its faint pulsing glow continued to creep along its surface, unbothered by their retreat. "Clamps are free," Harlan's voice came through the comms, edged with tension. "But the energy signatures are still radiating. Those things are persistent." Elias's knuckles whitened as he gripped the console. "Good work. Get back to the bridge. Malik, report." The communications officer's fingers danced over his console, his face illuminated by the shifting blue of the display. "Still tracking the coordinates embedded in the signal. It's moving, adjusting to a trajectory we're not aligned with." "Moving where?" Elias asked, the weight of uncertainty coiling in his chest. Malik hesitated. "It's hard to tell without recalibrating our sensors, but wherever it's heading, it's beyond known charts." The air on the bridge felt heavier, a tension thick enough to prick the skin. The faint throb of recycled oxygen felt sharper now, the filtered tang an unwelcome reminder of how fragile their environment was in this void. Elias inhaled deeply, forcing himself to steady his thoughts. Velar's voice cut through the quiet, his tone steady but grim. "Captain, whatever that signal is tied to, it's no accident. The way it's broadcasting, there's intent behind it. It's not just leading us somewhere, it's testing us." Elias turned sharply. "Explain." Velar gestured at his handheld device, the cracked display casting faint streaks of green. "The signal shifts every few seconds, like it's watching how we respond and adjusting accordingly. It's not a beacon, it's a conversation." The words struck Elias harder than he wanted to admit. His instincts screamed to pull back, but the calculated part of his mind demanded answers. The Vorak didn't operate like this. They were brutal, direct, efficient. This was something else entirely. "Captain," Harlan said as he re-entered the bridge, his face pale from exertion, "the ship's hull, The way it glowed and spread along the docking clamps, it wasn't just energy. It was altering itself, like it was alive. The bridge fell silent, the implications sinking into everyone present. Elias stared out at the alien ship, still motionless yet teeming with something far more dangerous than physical presence. The faint ripples of light now extended along the edges of its broken hull, creating patterns that seemed unnervingly deliberate. "We can't leave this unchecked," Vaylor said, breaking the silence. "If this thing is leading us to something worse, we need to know now, before it blindsides us." Elias's jaw tightened as he stared at the shifting glow. The weight of command pressed against his shoulders, but the path forward was clear. "Malik, triangulate those coordinates. Harland, prep the fleet for long-range pursuit. We'll follow the trail, but at a distance. No direct engagement unless I say otherwise." As the crew moved to carry out the orders, the alien vessel's glow faded suddenly, leaving only the cold darkness of its twisted frame. Elias frowned, an unshakable thought taking root in his mind. Whatever they were following, it was more than a trap. It was a challenge, and the next move wasn't theirs to make. The Eidolon drifted in formation with the fleet, the vast black expanse of uncharted space stretching endlessly before them. The coordinates provided by the alien signal hung on the navigation display like a distant, unreachable promise. Elias Rain stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes locked on the swirling patterns of the tactical hologram. Each pulse of light marked a step deeper into the unknown, and with every second, the atmosphere on the ship grew heavier. "Status on the fleet?" Elias asked, breaking the tense silence. "All ships maintaining course," Malik replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gripping everyone. "We've got full spectrum scans running, but the interference is still erratic. Whatever's at those coordinates, it's shielded by something we don't understand." Harlan crossed the bridge, his boots clinking softly on the polished floor. "We're running blind, Captain. That signal could be dragging us straight into a trap." Elias turned to face him, his expression unwavering. "Every trap is a test of perception. If we can see the edges, we can avoid the teeth." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Outside the viewport, stars flared and died, their light distant and cold. The faint glow of the Eidolon's navigation markers traced arcs through the void, a quiet reminder of their fragile progress. Elias shifted his stance, the subtle weight of his gear pressing into his shoulders. "Valar," Elias called, his voice slicing through the stillness. "Any updates on the signal patterns?" Valar, seated near the tactical console, tapped a few keys. His screen glowed faintly, casting shadows on his focused face. "It's cycling faster now, almost like it's accelerating us. Whatever it's leading us toward, it doesn't want us taking our time." "That's reassuring," Harlan muttered darkly. Elias stepped closer to the console, leaning over Valar's shoulder. The patterns on the screen weren't just random, they were deliberate, forming repeating fractals that shifted subtly with each new pulse. They reminded Elias of a predator circling its prey, testing defenses before moving in for the kill. "Valar," Elias said quietly, "is there a rhythm to these shifts?" Valar hesitated, his brow furrowed. "It's possible. The cycles repeat, but not identically. They evolve, adapting to our course corrections." Elias straightened, his mind racing. "It's learning from us." Before anyone could respond, the ship's lights flickered, a faint ripple of energy rolling through the deck. Malik's hands flew across his controls. "Captain, we're picking up gravitational distortions, severe ones." The viewport darkened momentarily, then flared with light. Ahead, the void warped and twisted, stars bending like reflections on a rippling pond. A massive structure emerged from the distortion, its surface a labyrinth of angular ridges and glowing fissures. The alien architecture pulsed with a rhythmic energy, matching the signal's frequency exactly. Harland exhaled sharply. "Well, that's inviting." Elias's jaw tightened as he studied the colossal structure. Its vastness dwarfed the fleet, a monument to power and intent. "Hold position. Bring the fleet into a defensive formation." The bridge fell silent again, but the weight of the discovery pressed against everyone. Whatever this structure was, it hadn't been built to welcome them. It was waiting to see how far they were willing to go, and Elias had no intention of turning back. The colossal structure loomed before the fleet, its intricate surface alive with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Captain Elias Wren felt the weight of its presence like a physical force, pressing against his chest. The alien architecture, riddled with deep, glowing fissures, pulsed in sync with the signal that had drawn them here. It wasn't just a construct. It felt deliberate, as though it had been waiting for them. "Fleet holding position," Malik reported, his voice strained but controlled. "Defensive grid activated. No immediate hostilities detected." "Define immediate," Harlan muttered, leaning over a console to study the energy readouts. "Because that thing looks like it could swallow us whole." Elias ignored the comment, his focus on the faintly rippling waves of energy emanating from the structure. The distortion in the space around it was subtle, bending starlight into faint halos that danced across the ship's reinforced glass. The air on the bridge felt charged, every breath sharp with anticipation. "Velar," Elias said, his voice low but firm, "analyze the energy patterns. Are they defensive or passive?" Velar's hands moved quickly over his console, the device's faint hum and undertone to the tense silence. "Difficult to say, Captain. The fluctuation suggests some kind of containment field, but it's not responding to us. It could be inert, or it could be waiting for a trigger." Elias narrowed his eyes. "And if we're the trigger?" Velar glanced up, the question hanging between them like a blade. "Then we'll know soon enough." A sudden pulse rippled through the structure, the glow along its fissures brightening and dimming in a sequence that resembled breathing. Elias straightened, his instincts bristling. "Malik," he ordered, his tone sharp. "Tight beam scans only. Do not engage any active systems. I want to know what's inside without waking it." "Understood," Malik replied, his fingers flying over the controls. The bridge lights flickered briefly as the ship's sensors adjusted, focusing their efforts on the alien construct. The scan returned fragmented images, a sprawling network of chambers and corridors, their walls lined with dense clusters of crystalline nodes. Deep within the structure's core, something large and angular rested, its surface obscured by layers of interference. "Captain," Malik said, his voice tight, "there's something alive in there, one massive energy signature, central to the structure." Elias's stomach twisted. Whatever lay at the heart of the construct, it was no dormant relic. "Any movement?" "None," Malik replied, though hesitation crept into his tone. "But its energy output is climbing, slowly but steadily." Harlan straightened from his console, his expression dark. "It's watching us, or worse, calculating." Elias turned to his crew, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. "We can't retreat now. Velar, prep a probe for deployment. We're going to get closer, but no direct contact until we understand what we're dealing with." The bridge crew moved with practiced precision, but the weight of the moment was palpable. As the probe detached from the eidolon, its faint beacon of light illuminated the jagged surface of the structure. The fissures pulsed in response, their rhythm quickening like a heartbeat, as though the probe's presence had been anticipated. Elias's grip tightened on the console, his pulse matching the accelerating glow. Whatever this thing was, it was no passive remnant. It was alive, waiting for its purpose to unfold. And the fleet had just knocked on its door. The probe drifted forward, a solitary beacon of light swallowed by the structure's looming darkness. Its signal pulsed back to the eidolon in sharp bursts, feeding fragmented data into the bridge's displays. Captain Elias Wren stood still, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched as he studied the shimmering holograms. Each fractured image revealed another piece of the labyrinthine interior, an endless network of crystalline corridors and impossible geometries that seemed to shift with every scan. "Probe is entering the outer perimeter," Malik reported, his tone clipped but steady. "Energy fluctuations are spiking again. That thing knows we're looking." "Anything defensive?" Elias asked, not taking his eyes off the swirling shapes. "Nothing yet, but the energy field around the structure is becoming more focused," Malik replied. "If it's a shield, it's not to keep us out. It's to keep something in." Elias's stomach churned. The idea that the structure might be less of a fortress and more of a cage tightened the knot of unease that had been building since they arrived. "Valar," Elias said, his voice low but urgent, "prepare an override. If that field shifts to an offensive mode, I want options." Valar nodded sharply, already working on his console. "Understood. But, Captain, I don't think this thing works like anything we've seen. It's reacting to everything we do. It's like it's alive, adapting as we move." Before Elias could respond, the holographic feed crackled. The probe's signal faltered, the clean lines of its transmitted data distorting into jagged fragments. On the main display, the image of the structure's core pulsed violently, a blinding surge of light radiating from within. "Probe feed is degrading!" Malik shouted, his hands flying over the controls. "Energy output from the core is overwhelming the sensors." "Pull it back," Elias barked, "before we lose it completely." The team watched as the probe veered, its small thrusters sputtering against the gravitational distortions emanating from the structure. Then, with a sudden lurch, it stopped, suspended mid-flight as if caught by an invisible hand. The faint glow of its beacon flickered, then extinguished entirely. "It's gone," Malik said, his voice barely a whisper. The bridge fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Elias gritted his teeth, his mind racing through the possibilities. This wasn't just a machine. It was something far more dangerous. Before anyone could speak, the structure responded. A deep, resonant vibration rippled through space, passing through the Eidolon and the fleet like a wave. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, a low thrum in their bones that set every nerve on edge. "Energy surge from the core," Valar called, panic creeping into his voice. "It's shifting. I don't know what it's doing, but it's building power." Elias slammed his hand on the console. "Full defensive grid. All ships, fall back to minimum safe distance." Outside the viewport, the fissures along the structure's surface blazed with violent intensity, their once rhythmic pulses now a chaotic strobe. The ship's lights dimmed as interference bled into their systems, alarms chiming faintly in the background. "Captain," Harlan said, his voice grim as he stepped forward, "whatever's in there, it's waking up." Elias didn't reply. He stared at the glowing monolith, a cold certainty settling in his chest. This wasn't an encounter. It was an invocation, and whatever they had stirred was far from finished. The bridge of the Eidolon vibrated faintly as the structure's energy surged, sending ripples through the void around it. Captain Elias Wren gripped the edge of his console, his gaze locked on the glowing fissures that now erupted with jagged arcs of light. The patterns writhed like veins pumping molten fire, and the resonance grew louder, a bass note that reverberated in the marrow of every bone. "Report!" Elias barked, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Core energy output is escalating beyond safe thresholds," Valar said, his fingers flying over his console. His brow was slick with sweat, and his voice carried a tremor he couldn't hide. "It's reaching levels that could destabilize the surrounding gravitational field." "What does that mean for us?" Elias asked, his tone sharp and urgent. Valar hesitated, his eyes darting across the data streaming onto his screen. "If it collapses, we're talking about a spatial implosion, a gravity well strong enough to crush anything within range." Elias turned to Harlan, his second-in-command, who stood rigid, his face grim. "Pull the fleet back. Establish a safe perimeter." Harlan nodded, relaying orders to the other ships. Outside the viewport, the smaller vessels began retreating, their movements precise yet cautious, as if the wrong thrust could trigger the structure's wrath. The Eidolon remained stationary, its sensors locked onto the pulsating core. "Captain," Malik called from his station, his voice low but tense, "we're detecting movement inside the structure." Elias's jaw tightened. "Define movement." "It's not physical," Malik replied, his hands moving deftly over the controls. "It's the energy, shifting like a tidal wave, converging toward the core. Whatever it's building, it's deliberate." The lights on the bridge flickered again, shadows stretching and contracting with each pulse of the alien construct. The air felt heavier, as if charged with static, a faint prickle crawling across the skin of everyone present. Elias's fingers curled against the console, his mind racing through possibilities. "Vaylor," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding. "Options?" Vaylor glanced up, his expression pale but determined. "We could try to disrupt the energy buildup. If we focus a nullification burst at the right frequency, it might destabilize the core." "And if it fails?" Harland asked grimly. "Then we're likely accelerating whatever it's preparing to do," Vaylor admitted, his tone blunt. "But doing nothing isn't an option." Elias nodded sharply. "Prep the nullification burst. Harland, coordinate with the fleet to cover our approach. We're not letting this thing finish its countdown." The bridge crew moved with disciplined urgency, each station alive with activity. Outside, the Eidolon adjusted its trajectory, its thrusters firing in calculated bursts as it approached the structure. The glowing fissures intensified, their patterns growing erratic, as if sensing the fleet's intent. "Nullification system online," Vaylor announced. "Ready on your command." Elias took a breath, his gaze fixed on the searing light pouring from the core. His voice was steady as he gave the order. "Fire." A pulse of energy shot from the Eidolon, its trajectory precise and unyielding. It struck the core, and for a brief moment the structure stilled, its glow dimming to a faint flicker. Then came the response. The core erupted in a blinding surge of light, the fissures splitting wide as an impossibly deep sound tore through the void. The Eidolon shuddered violently, the shock wave rolling over its hull like an invisible tidal force. Alarms screamed across the bridge as the crew scrambled to stabilize the ship. "Captain!" Vaylor shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "The energy isn't dissipating, it's amplifying." Elias stared at the display, the realization hitting him like a blow. Whatever they'd done, it hadn't stopped the structure. It had awakened it. And now, it was fully alive. The Eidolon trembled as another wave of energy pulsed from the alien structure, its force slamming into the ship's shields like a tidal surge against fragile stone. Lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the bridge as Captain Elias Wren gripped the edge of his console to steady himself. The deep resonance of the core now carried a rhythm, like a heartbeat growing stronger, faster, hungrier. "Shields are holding," Harland reported, though his voice was taut, his eyes darting between damage readouts. "But that last wave pushed us to critical strain. Another hit like that, and we're vulnerable." Elias nodded, his focus razor-sharp as he scanned the holographic display. The core's energy output was no longer erratic. It was deliberate, controlled, each surge rippling outward with surgical precision. The structure was no longer reacting to them. It was orchestrating something far more dangerous. "Malik, what's the status of the fleet?" Elias barked. "Outer vessels have pulled to a safe distance," Malik replied, his fingers gliding over the comms array. "They're holding formation, but the interference is making coordination unstable. We're losing secure channels one by one." "Maintain local control," Elias ordered. "Vaylor, give me an update on that amplification. Is there a pattern?" Vaylor's face was pale, beads of sweat trickling down his temple as he analyzed the core's energy signatures. His hands moved quickly, a controlled flurry of motion. "It's not random, Captain. The core is harmonizing with the spatial distortion field around it. It's creating a breach." Elias's eyes narrowed. "Breach to where?" Vaylor swallowed hard, his voice dropping. "Somewhere outside our physical understanding. If it stabilizes, it could tear open a rift capable of consuming everything in this sector." The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. The alien construct wasn't just a trap or a weapon. It was a doorway, and they were standing on the threshold of whatever horrors lay beyond. "Captain," Malik shouted suddenly, his screen lighting up with fresh data. "We're picking up incoming signatures, multiple. They're Vorak ships, closing fast." Elias's jaw tightened as he turned to the viewport. In the distance, faint flashes of light marked the arrival of Vorak warships, their angular silhouettes unmistakable. Their engines glowed like molten iron, leaving streaks of crimson against the blackness of space. "They're here for the structure," Harlan said grimly. "No way they'll let us leave alive now." Elias straightened, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "Harlan, prepare defensive maneuvers. Valar, prioritize disruption. Whatever they want from that core, we're not letting them have it." The bridge erupted into controlled urgency as orders flew between stations. The Eidolon pivoted, its engines flaring as it positioned itself between the core and the incoming ships. The fleet's other vessels adjusted in kind, forming a protective perimeter around the alien structure. As the Vorak ships closed the distance, their weapons began to glow, arcs of energy building along their sleek hulls. The air on the bridge felt charged, the tension palpable, each breath carrying the electric anticipation of a storm about to break. "They're locking on," Malik warned, his voice tight. "First salvo incoming." "Brace," Elias commanded. The Vorak fired and space lit up in a symphony of destruction. Bolts of searing energy streaked toward the Eidolon, colliding with its shields in bursts of blinding light. The ship shuddered violently, the deck beneath Elias's feet trembling as though it might give way. Alarms wailed, their shrill tones cutting through the chaos. "Shields down to 70%, Harlan called, gripping the railing as the ship rocked again. "They're focusing everything on us." Elias's mind raced, his thoughts a calculated torrent of decisions. "Redirect power to forward shields and return fire. Valar, prep an EMP burst, short range. I want those Vorak sensors blind." The ship responded with a vengeance, its cannons roaring to life. Streams of concentrated energy streaked toward the Vorak ships, striking their shields and forcing them into evasive maneuvers. In the chaos, the alien core pulsed brighter, its energy escalating, the fissures along its surface widening like a wound tearing open. Elias stared at the core, a grim realization settling in his gut. The Vorak weren't here to destroy it. They were here to ensure it opened. The Eidolon groaned under the strain of incoming fire, its shields flaring with bursts of blue light as each Vorak salvo pounded against the defensive grid. The bridge trembled with every impact, the vibrations rippling through the reinforced deck plates and settling uneasily in the bones of everyone present. Captain Elias Rain stood firm, his eyes locked on the tactical display, where the Vorak fleet maneuvered with ruthless precision. "They're closing in, Captain," Malik reported, his voice tight as he adjusted comms channels. 3 ships attempting to flank us on the starboard side." "Harlan, adjust defensive patterns," Elias ordered. "Redirect fire to intercept their approach. I don't want them anywhere near that structure." The alien core loomed in the distance, its glowing fissures now spilling arcs of light that coiled and twisted like serpents in the void. The patterns weren't random. They moved with intention, spreading further into the surrounding space. Elias could feel it, a growing, undeniable force that seemed to press against the ship like the weight of a tidal wave yet to crest. "Valar," Elias said sharply, turning to his tactical officer. "Status on the EMP?" "Charged and ready," Valar replied, his fingers flying over the console. "But we'll only get one clean shot. If we mistime it—" "We won't," Elias cut him off. "When I give the order, fire." Harlan leaned over the railing, his gaze fixed on the shifting energy patterns emanating from the core. "Captain, I think they're trying to synchronize their fire with the structure. If that thing opens while they're still in range—" Elias understood the unspoken implication. If the core's breach stabilized, the Vorak wouldn't just control it, they'd weaponize it. "Then we make sure it doesn't," Elias said, his voice hard. "Malik, broadcast fleet-wide. I want every available ship focusing fire on their lead vessel. Break their coordination." As the orders rippled through the fleet, the Eidolon pivoted, its cannons roaring to life. Streams of molten energy streaked across the void, converging on the Vorak's largest ship. The impact was immediate. The enemy vessel's shields flared violently before collapsing in a cascade of crackling energy. The explosion lit the battlefield, casting harsh shadows across the alien structure. "They're scattering!" Malik called out, relief tinging his voice. "Their formation's breaking apart." "Not for long," Valar muttered, his eyes glued to the growing energy surge at the core. "That thing's close to full charge." A sharp warning tone cut through the bridge. Malik's display flared red, new data streaming across the screen. Captain, the core is emitting a signal, broad spectrum and directed. Elias's pulse quickened. Directed where? Deep space, Malik replied, his voice low. It's not random, it's calling something. The bridge fell silent, the weight of Malik's words sinking in like a stone. Outside, the core's fissures widened further, spilling radiant light that seemed to pierce through the void itself. Elias's jaw tightened as he turned back to Velar. Activate the EMP, now. Velar hesitated for only a second before slamming his hand onto the console. A burst of energy rippled outward from the Eidolon, a silent shockwave that raced toward the core and the Vorak ships. For a brief moment, everything stilled. The energy arcs froze, the fissures dimmed, and even the enemy ships seemed to falter. Then the core pulsed violently, a blinding flash tearing through the void. Elias shielded his eyes as the ship rocked violently, the bridge lights flickering as systems scrambled to compensate. Velar, what just happened? Elias demanded. Velar's voice was tight with dread. The EMP disrupted it, but it didn't stop it. It's accelerating. Elias stared at the tactical display, where the core now burned with an intensity that felt alive. Whatever it was calling, it was already on its way. The Eidolon hung in the void, its systems strained and alarms still echoing faintly across the bridge. The alien core pulsed like a star on the brink of eruption, its radiance flooding the tactical displays with shifting patterns of energy. Captain Elias Wren took a slow breath, forcing himself to steady under the mounting chaos. Every decision had to count now. Velar, Elias began, his voice calm but edged with urgency. How much time before the core stabilizes? Velar's fingers moved deftly over his console, his eyes flicking between overlapping streams of data. Minutes at best, Captain. The energy feedback is accelerating exponentially. It's like it's feeding off our disruption. Elias's jaw tightened. Malik, I need a clear line to the fleet. Malik nodded, adjusting the comms interface. You're live. Elias straightened, his tone firm as he addressed the fleet. This is Captain Wren. The core is reaching critical levels, and the Vorak are trying to ensure it stabilizes. If they succeed, we could be looking at a catastrophic breach. Our objective is clear. We disrupt their control, neutralize their forces, and shut that core down. The bridge crew exchanged tense glances, but the air buzzed with determination. Here's the plan, Elias continued. Velar, I want you to synchronize the fleet's firepower on specific fissures along the core's surface. Target the junctions where the energy flow is most concentrated. Malik, I need our ships operating in two waves. First to create a diversion, second to deliver precision strikes. Velar's brow furrowed as he examined the core's patterns. Those fissures are volatile, Captain. If we hit them wrong... We're not hitting them wrong, Elias interrupted. This has to be precise. Get me a targeting matrix. Harlan stepped forward, his tone measured but urgent. What about the Vorak ships? They're not going to sit back and watch us tear their prize apart. Elias nodded. That's where the second wave comes in. Divide our lighter frigates into rapid response teams. Their job is to harass the Vorak flanks, draw their fire, and keep them scattered. Meanwhile, the destroyers will focus on suppressing the lead ships. Malik's hands flew over his controls, coordinating the fleet's maneuvers. Fleet acknowledged, Captain. They're moving into position. Outside the viewport, the human fleet shifted into a calculated formation. Smaller vessels darted toward the Vorak lines, their engines blazing trails of light as they engaged in swift, precise attacks. The larger ships maintained a steady perimeter, their cannons trained on the core's glowing surface. Velar, status on the targeting matrix, Elias demanded. Almost there, Velar replied, sweat glistening on his temple. Got it. Transmitting to the fleet now. The tactical display updated, highlighting the core's fissures in sharp, vivid detail. Each point glowed like a fragile seam waiting to rupture. Elias's gaze hardened. All ships, fire on my command. Seconds stretched like hours as the fleet's weapons charged, their targeting systems locking onto the designated points. The core's pulses grew more frantic, its radiance flickering as if sensing the impending assault. Fire! Elias commanded. The void erupted with streams of energy, the coordinated barrage striking the core in perfect unison. The fissures buckled under the impact, splintering outward in jagged cracks. The bridge shuddered as shock waves rippled from the core, its light dimming for a fraction of a second before flaring brighter than ever. "Direct hits," Velar reported, his voice tight. "But it's not enough. The core is compensating." Elias's mind raced as he gripped the console. The payoff wasn't complete yet, but they had momentum. Harland, initiate fallback positions for the frigates. Velar, prep the secondary array. We're going to finish this. The battle outside intensified, but Elias could see the strategy working. The Vorak lines were thinning, their ships faltering as the human fleet executed its plan with surgical precision. The core remained a threat, but for the first time, Elias felt the tide shifting in their favor. They just needed one more push. The void around the alien core was a maelstrom of fire and light, the coordinated strikes from the fleet rippling across its surface like waves crashing against an unyielding cliff. Captain Elias Wren stood firm at the center of the Eidolon's bridge, the glow of the tactical display reflecting off his steely gaze. The core's fissures, now jagged and erratic, spewed arcs of raw energy into space, each pulse sending tremors that rattled the deck beneath his boots. "Velar, status on the secondary array," Elias demanded, his voice carrying over the chaotic din of activity. Velar's hands moved with precision, his eyes locked on the fluctuating energy patterns displayed on his console. "Array is 70% charged, Captain. We're synchronizing with the fleet to maximize impact." Elias nodded, his jaw tightening as he turned to Harland. "What's the state of the Vorak fleet?" Harland's fingers danced across his station, pulling up a tactical overview. "Their formation is crumbling. Our frigates are keeping them off balance, but 2 of their cruisers are trying to reposition toward the core. If they stabilize it—" "They won't," Elias interrupted. "Malik, redirect our destroyers to intercept those cruisers. Harland, I want the frigates to box them in. Force them into the kill zone." "Acknowledged," Harland replied, already relaying the orders. Outside the viewport, the human fleet moved with surgical precision. The smaller frigates darted like needles through the Vorak formation, their coordinated strikes herding the enemy ships into tighter, more vulnerable positions. The larger destroyers followed with punishing fire, their weapons tearing into Vorak shields and hulls with unrelenting force. The alien core, now resembling a fractured star, pulsed violently, its light strobing across the battlefield. The fissures expanded, spilling radiant energy that bent the fabric of space around it. Elias could feel the pressure building, an invisible force pressing against his chest with every pulse. "Velar, what's the risk if we push the array beyond capacity?" Elias asked, his tone sharp. Velar hesitated, his fingers pausing for a fraction of a second. "It'll destabilize our systems. We might lose propulsion or shields, possibly both. But it'll amplify the strike significantly." Elias didn't hesitate. "Do it." Velar gave a curt nod, his focus unbroken as he overrode the safety protocols. The bridge lights dimmed momentarily, and a deep vibration resonated through the ship as the secondary array absorbed power from the core systems. "Array at full charge," Velar reported. "Fleet is aligned for the strike." Elias turned to the tactical display, his voice steady but commanding. "This is it. All ships, prepare to fire on my mark. Target the core's central junction. If we hit it right, we can collapse the entire structure." The bridge held its collective breath as the fleet adjusted their positions, their weapons aligning in perfect unison. The core's light grew blinding, its fissures writhing like a living thing fighting against its own destruction. "Fire!" Elias commanded. The void erupted in a symphony of destruction. Streams of energy from every ship converged on the core, striking the central junction with blinding intensity. The impact was immediate. A shock wave tore through the structure, splintering the fissures into cascading fragments of light. The core pulsed one final time before imploding, its radiance collapsing inward like a dying star. The Eidolon shuddered as the shock wave hit, but its shields held. The bridge crew erupted into cheers as the tactical display cleared, showing the remnants of the core scattered across the battlefield. Elias allowed himself a brief exhale, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Harland, status?" "The core is gone," Harland replied, a rare smile breaking across his face. "And the Vorak fleet is in full retreat." Elias nodded, his gaze returning to the viewport. The battle was won, but the weight of what they'd just prevented lingered heavily. Whatever the core had been, it was no longer a threat. For now. The shattered remains of the alien core drifted in the void, glowing faintly as their energy dissipated into the endless darkness. The bridge of the Eidolon buzzed with muted relief, though no one dared relax completely. Captain Elias Wren stood at the tactical display, his eyes fixed on the retreating Vorak ships, their once proud formation now scattered like ash in the wind. The weight of the battle lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. "They're falling back beyond sensor range," Malik said, breaking the silence. His voice carried a tremor of disbelief. "They're running. They'll regroup," Harland muttered, his tone dark. "The Vorak don't stay down for long. They've lost this battle, not the war." Elias's gaze hardened. This wasn't just a battle to them. That core wasn't a weapon. It was a message. They were trying to tell the galaxy that resistance is meaningless, that nothing could stop them. He turned, his voice rising with a quiet ferocity that cut through the lingering tension. "But we just did." The bridge fell silent, every eye turning to him. The hum of equipment and the faint crackle of distant static were the only sounds, grounding them in the fragile moment between triumph and the unknown. Elias took a measured breath, his hand gripping the edge of the console. "They came to make an example of us," he continued, his voice steady, laced with conviction. "But instead, we showed them what humanity is capable of. We don't just endure, we adapt, we outthink. And when the moment calls for it, we strike back with everything we have." Vaylor leaned back in his seat, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "They'll remember this. The Vorak don't retreat often, and they never forget the ones who force them to." Elias's eyes flicked to the viewport, where the last faint glimmers of the core's remnants faded into the distance. "Good. Let them remember. Let them tell their fleets, their commanders, their leaders, what happened here, because this isn't the end. It's the beginning." Harland stepped closer, his brow furrowed with wary respect. "You're saying we take the fight to them?" Elias's gaze met his, unwavering. "We don't wait for them to rebuild. We've seen what they'll sacrifice to expand their empire. Entire systems, countless lives. They don't stop until they're stopped." Malik straightened at his station, his tone cautious but resolute. "And what if we're not ready? They've had centuries to perfect their war machine." Elias's lips curved into a faint, almost dangerous smile. "We just proved that centuries mean nothing when you can think faster, move smarter, and strike harder. They'll underestimate us again. They always do. And next time, we won't just drive them back, we'll dismantle them." The crew exchanged glances, the gravity of his words settling into a shared determination. They had survived the impossible, faced the Vorak on their terms, and walked away stronger. Elias turned back to the tactical display, his voice cutting through the bridge like steel. "Broadcast to the fleet. Let them know the message is clear. Humanity doesn't wait to be hunted. We take the fight to the enemy." The bridge erupted into activity, the crew moving with renewed purpose. Outside the viewport, the stars gleamed brighter against the dark canvas of space. The wreckage of the core was gone, but its shadow remained, a reminder of what they had destroyed and what lay ahead. As the Eidolon began its next maneuver, Elias stood tall, his voice calm but charged with resolve. "This is the moment they realize we're not prey. We're the predators, and we're just getting started." The fleet drifted in silence as the distant glow of the alien core's remains faded completely, swallowed by the vastness of space. Captain Elias Wren stood at the center of the Eidolon's bridge, his silhouette outlined by the faint, pulsating lights of the tactical display. The weight of victory hung in the air, but it was not one of celebration. It was heavier, more resolute, a quiet understanding that their triumph had ignited something far larger than themselves. "Status report," Elias commanded, his voice steady, though the gravity of the moment was unmistakable. Malik glanced up from his console, his face illuminated by faint, flickering readouts. Fleet is regrouping. Minor damage across several ships, but no critical losses. Vorak forces are in full retreat, scattering beyond our current sensor range. Valor leaned back in his chair, his features drawn but his expression resolute. They didn't just retreat, Captain. They ran. They know what we're capable of now.